Good afternoon and welcome to a live virtual panel hosted by the America First Policy Institute and the Manhattan Institute. Today's panel, Foreign Influence in the Academy, will look at how U.S. adversaries are reshaping elite American universities and what policy leaders should do about it. We have a truly outstanding panel today. General Mick Zais is a former Deputy Secretary of Education and AFPI Senior Fellow. After a 31-year military career, he served in several education leadership positions, including as president of Newberry College and as South Carolina's elected state superintendent of education. He was also a professor at West Point and was chief of war plans at the Pentagon. Ilya Shapiro is a senior fellow and director of constitutional studies at the Manhattan Institute. Prior to joining the Manhattan Institute, Ilya was executive director at the Georgetown Center for the Constitution, and before that, vice president of the Cato Institute. His forthcoming book, due for release this September, is entitled Lawless: The Miseducation of America's Elite. Joanne Florino is the Adam Meyerson Distinguished Fellow in Philanthropic Excellence at the Philanthropy Roundtable, where she was previously senior vice president for policy. Joanne consults with and advises foundations and individual donors with a special focus on protecting donor intent and special emphasis on higher education. She's also an advisory board member of the Legal Insurrection Foundation. I'm Jonathan Pedluzhny, the moderator. I direct AFPI's Higher Education Reform Initiative. To start things off, I'd like to offer some background on the problem. Billions in foreign money flow to U.S. campuses. 50 years ago, the focus was donations from the Middle East to fund faculty positions and centers to study the Arab world. Today, there are also serious concerns about China's influence in the theft of intellectual property, including sensitive government-funded research. The first set of concerns led Congress to establish a foreign gift reporting requirement in 1986. Twice a year, institutions are legally required to report gifts and contracts above $250,000 to the U.S. Department of Education. Historically, the department hasn't enforced the requirement and compliance has been lackluster. That changed in 2019 when the Trump administration opened 12 non-compliance investigations. That catalyzed the disclosure of $6.5 billion in previously unreported gifts from 2014 to 2019. Mick, you were deputy secretary at the time. Can you tell us more about what the department found?
Well, we really started working on this problem seriously after a Senate Committee on Investigations held hearings, and what was making them nervous was the presence on campuses throughout America of over 100 so-called Confucius Institutes, which were instruments of soft Chinese Communist Party propaganda. And we realized that we had not been enforcing the statutes in the past and began some investigations. We found that, as you pointed out, $6.5 billion in foreign money was pouring into our colleges and universities, and contrary to the law, was not being reported. Our first step was to identify the most egregious offenders and put them in notice with official letters and put them under investigation. As I recall, they were Rutgers, Cornell, University of Maryland, Texas, Texas A&M, Yale, Stanford, Harvard, MIT. I think there was two more. I can't recall what they were.
It's impressive that you remembered all those.
Did you say Carnegie Mellon?
Carnegie Mellon, okay. And the first 6 most egregious offenders, we wrote a letter, addressed it to the presidents. I personally called the presidents the day before. Read the letter to them, explained that we're going to release it to the public tomorrow, and asked for their support in providing the documents that we would be soliciting as part of our investigation. Of course, this hit the news, the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is read by senior administrators across the country, ran a big article. So at that point in time, all of the big research universities knew that they were going to be held accountable, and that's what prompted the $6.5 billion of late reporting. Later, we added a couple more institutions to the investigation. We updated the portal where the institutions had to input the data to make it easier to input the data. And let me emphasize, it's not against the law to accept these donations. But there is a law that you have to report them, so there's transparency to Congress and the American people.
So if I recall from reading the report, we're talking about a pretty small number of universities that received this influx of billions of dollars, so something like 300 altogether.
Yes.
Yeah, and then those that received the largest amounts, Cornell, Harvard, we're talking 900 million, billion, 1.2 billion, I think at Carnegie Mellon, right, over just 5 years, right? So the question becomes, well, we'll get to the question of what they're paying for first, but before we jump into what they're buying, what kind of influence they're buying, can I ask you what the Biden administration has done on this reporting requirement?
What the Biden administration has done is disregard totally the intent and the letter of the law and Congress. One of the first things they did when they came into office was to suspend ongoing investigations, and they've started no new investigations. Interestingly, the Department of Education did not announce they were suspending the investigations. The American Council on Education, which is the higher education special interest lobby group here in Washington, announced it to their members and to the Department of Education that these investigations were being terminated. The other thing they did to stifle this whole law was they moved enforcement from the Department of Education's Office of the General Counsel over to the Office of Federal Student Aid. Now, the Office of Federal Student Aid is not manned, doesn't have the talent, is no more ready to enforce these statutes than the Office of the General Counsel is prepared to manage federal student loans and grants. But by moving it over, they guaranteed that nothing would happen.
And it's a signal to the universities that they're just not serious about it.
Exactly, and they're not serious about it. And to some degree, I fault Congress for letting them get away with it.
Well, we will get to a congressional solution at the end of the show. But let's start by talking about what they're buying, what kind of influence they're buying. And so, Ilya, let's start with the Gulf money that's flowing to elite campuses. We know Qatar entities alone have directed $2.7 billion to U.S. universities, more than $1 billion originated in Saudi Arabia, and that's just over the last 5 years where there was reporting. What are they getting for it?
Yeah, not just money flowing in. These universities are establishing centers in Qatar. Georgetown, Texas A&M, I think there's a half dozen high-level ones that just opened up in recent years. And it turns out that levels of foreign funding inversely correlate with levels of freedom of speech, a spirit of free inquiry. All of these things that we've been noticing that have been growing on college campuses, cancel culture, the growth of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion bureaucracies that stifle speech and subvert classical academic values of academic freedom and due process, equal application of the law. All of these things go down when foreign funding comes up. And also things like anti-Semitism. Even before October 7th, campuses that were funded abroad, because this is a lot from authoritarian countries, especially in the Middle East, that is, you're importing those kinds of views. And then since October 7th, that's become really prevalent. And at a place like MIT, for example, which I think has 30% of its students are foreign, they warned students that were violating actual policies, blocking access to places, doing physical things, not just speech policing, but blocking actual policies. They warned students that they were violating those policies. They kept doing it, and then MIT said, we're not going to punish them because these are foreign students, and that would mean they would have to leave. Their visas would be pulled. So in effect, this foreign money buys freedom, if you will, to do things that violate the rules that even American students don't.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. Let's start by highlighting that association. So we know the universities that receive the most in foreign gifts have the highest levels of student-on-student harassment, and we also know that the more foreign money, the more speech problems you have. So what are these foreign gifts funding that are having that consequence?
It's in part more professors and centers that have an illiberal perspective on the world. You might be familiar with critical race theory or queer theory. Well, this is kind of a decolonization theory of oppressor-oppressed classes that views the world through these lenses of identity that subvert the search for truth and knowledge and freedom of speech and all of these different things. So whether it's professors or the bureaucracies or indeed the students themselves that are coming and are less prepared than the average student that's admitted to these places, it's not doing good things for the educational mission.
Yeah, so that's a point I'd like to emphasize, right? We know that universities that have pro-BDS faculty, that's boycott, divest, sanction Israel, or that have the outright anti-Zionist faculty, they're organizing events. This kind of lends a kind of respectability in the mind of young people to those extreme views. And again, right, the key point is universities that are hosting these faculty members, they're the ones that also see the student-on-student harassment that's really captured attention in the last few months.
It fundamentally goes against Western values, against American values. You see that tension erupting again and again, and you know it's all part of that intersectional melange, if you will, from the homegrown critical race theory and other things that have led to these burgeoning DEI bureaucracies that make people walk on eggshells, that are afraid to express their views or even teach certain subjects.
The irony is that this anti-Western ideology that is being espoused on so many campuses and in these centers for Middle Eastern studies ignore the fact that most of the things that had lifted billions of people out of poverty across Africa and Asia and the Middle East, the scientific method, the spirit of inquiry, a hard work ethic, advanced medicine, capitalism, are all inventions of the Western world and that have done more to improve the lives of people around the globe. And now West is being blamed for all the problems in the world. It's just ironic.
And this is the whole subject of this panel, is one aspect of this phenomenon that we're seeing in higher ed on campus that has come to the national fore after October 7th with the disastrous testimony of the university presidents in December and so forth. We're now learning about cancel culture and professors teaching illiberal things and these DEI bureaucracies, et cetera. But this foreign funding bit and how we're actually importing illiberal ideas is an important part of the process.
Yeah. Joanne?
Yeah, so I would like to add to what Ilya and the General have said. You know, one of the bigger problems that I see is that this is not limited to studies of Asia or to Middle East studies. It's bled into almost every part of the curriculum. So I try to keep track of what's happening in terms of teaching American history, civics, anything in that area, and all of those trends, you know, victim, oppressor, colonization, decolonization, they are now present in the American history faculty and the curriculum that's being taught. So if our students are intending to have a more globalist outlook, America falls on the side of the bad guys. I don't know how else to say it. And so you're getting a lot of these trends have just now merged on campuses. And I'm coming here today from the Philanthropy Roundtable, and you know, we have a very strong belief in freedom to give wherever, whenever, and to whatever you want to. And that presence of philanthropic freedom is what we think keeps our country strong. But we also recognize that in some cases, it has actually caused detriment. You know, it hasn't been an advance at all. And that's a very big concern on the college campuses now.
Yeah, I'll share an astonishing anecdote that sort of brings together what you and the General just said. I have personal knowledge of a university that changed its general education program because of Saudi pressure. A lot of Saudi money went to this particular university, and the Saudis did not want students taking American government, American democracy. There was a strong American democracy requirement. They didn't want it, and so a course was created called Humanities 230 that essentially became an Islamic theology course that you could take to get through Gen Ed instead of the American democracy. Right, so that's the level of pressure some of these...
Can you name names?
Oh, I'd prefer not to name names at this juncture, but I'll tell you after the panel.
So I guess you have to just Google Humanities 230 and see what comes up.
Well, let's move so that we can get to some audience questions. Let's move to China. So General, can you tell us a little bit about the China angle to this problem?
Right now we have about 250,000 Chinese students in American colleges and universities, primarily in the science, technology, engineering, and math fields, but also in the medical fields. And they are stealing all of our research. Now, the American taxpayers pay about $150 billion a year for research, much of which is done, of course, in our large research universities. The Chinese are lots of things, but they're not stupid. And they've figured out that it's easier to steal American research and technology than to do their own. So they send their best and their brightest students, particularly their graduate students in these STEM fields. And professors, of course, are happy to have these very bright, hardworking, diligent Chinese students in their research laboratories. We're also hampered by a couple of factors that obtain on college campuses. College campuses in general have a culture of openness. Faculty believe in large measure that knowledge is for all of mankind and we should share it openly, notwithstanding that much of it is proprietary or even classified. They're very trusting, faculty are, and never believe that their graduate students are stealing information on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. We know that the Chinese students look after each other, and that if a student talks to the wrong people, says the wrong thing, takes the wrong courses, that there'll be a party official knocking on the door of their parents, telling them that they need to get their child back in line or serious consequences may occur. Christopher Wray, the head of the FBI, had a famous quotation when the FBI was looking at the problem of Chinese theft of intellectual property. Let me read it for you. Quote, "The people of the United States are the victims of what amounts to Chinese theft on a scale so massive that it represents one of the largest transfers of wealth in human history." And estimates are somewhere between 225 billion and 600 billion. It's a serious, serious problem. And all of it is to achieve the Chinese goal to dominate the United States economically and militarily, because the two go hand in hand. It's hard to have military power unless you have economic power, and they have a worldwide strategy to achieve that goal.
Yeah, I saw that Senate report that I think you're referencing, and it specifically identifies Chinese officials who said the only way that we can achieve military and economic supremacy over the United States is by leveraging U.S. campuses. Now, you've mentioned three ways in which Chinese money is corrupting the U.S. campus. They're stealing intellectual property, some of which is paid for by the federal government through grant programs. We have this free speech program, and then we have the propaganda problem, right? So let's start with the intellectual theft problem. How are they actually doing it? Like, what does it look like in practice?
Well, in practice, students are required to bring information home and report. We've had documented cases, some of which have been prosecuted in U.S. court, of students downloading materials on their computers, going home for vacation with hard disks full of proprietary information. And that's the main example. But the Chinese also have another program that doesn't involve students. It involves professors. And it's called the 1,000 Talents Program. As an example of how that operates, the chairman of the Department of Chemistry and Chemical Biology at Harvard was found out was being paid $50,000 a month by the Chinese Communist Party and had a living expense budget of $158,000 a year. Now, the Chinese were not giving $750,000 a year to this professor just to cultivate goodwill. The professor had lied about this income on his application for grants and then lied about it to the FBI when the FBI questioned him. Now, that's just one example. The 1,000 Talents Program is spread across America. And so the Chinese are paying professors in the back door to get information from them, share their research.
And my understanding is the expectation is both that they'll hire Chinese grad students and so teach them in U.S. labs, but in some cases, some of these faculty actually go to China during their summer, because they're 9-month faculty, and they build shadow labs over the course of a couple of years.
Yeah, we had American faculty in the Wuhan lab that reputedly was the source of COVID virus.
Wow, so clear national security implications. Well, why don't we shift to the campus culture implications of this Chinese money? Ilya and Joanne, I know these are the issues that you work on. How is Chinese?
Well, I was just thinking, as the general was talking, that there's a delicious, or not a delicious, a bitter irony here in that on the science side, on the STEM side, where there's, the espionage is going on, the intellectual property theft, they're taking advantage of the openness of our culture, of our academic society, etc. Whereas on the humanities and social science side, they're trying to subvert the values that produce that openness. That's got to be intentional. It's not just doing things that make sense. It's a concerted pincer effort. It seems like, but. Yeah, all of this money from this is not. I think we'd be less concerned if this money was coming from Canada and Italy and Japan, but it's coming from authoritarian places that not only want to benefit themselves, but they want to sow chaos in America as the next generation of leaders are being educated. And I look at law schools a lot. I'm a constitutional lawyer, and it's just so worrying that the next generation's gatekeepers of our legal and political institutions are taught that rule of law is a myth. It's all illegitimate. We have to blow everything up and restructure societies in radical ways. Tremendously dangerous.
So I've attended an event at one of the universities in question where a young Chinese student did speak about the fact that he was perfectly aware of America's commitment to free speech, and he didn't really have his own issue with that, but that he was constantly remembering that he had family in China. And so that he was not inclined to say anything that he was thinking. Same university, an incident where they brought in a speaker to discuss human rights internationally, and when that speaker mentioned the situation of the Uyghurs in China, the Chinese national students in the room stood up and essentially prevented any further discussion of that. I mean, that's completely antithetic to what we want our children to be doing and and the values that they want to learn. And I find that, one of the most dangerous things happening on campus, where students are already, in many cases, self-censoring because they're worried about peer pressure or how faculty would treat them. That then to have this example in front of them, it's not going to breed a healthier climate on campus.
Yeah. And Americans are very polite. We don't want to offend anybody, particular foreigners. So if there's Chinese in the room, Americans are very reluctant to talk about suppression of the Tibetans, suppression of the democracy movement in Hong Kong, or the imprisonment of hundreds of thousands of Muslim Uyghurs in the western part of China. It just has a dampening effect on free speech and the exchange of ideas.
Yeah, and it's designed to, right? I completely believe that. So university leaders know this is happening, right? There's no question, right? They know that their university is getting hundreds of millions, $1 billion over the course of 5 years from China and Gulf states. Why don't they do anything about it, right? Let me read a quote from the 2020 Department of Education report. Institutional decision-making is generally divorced from any sense of obligation to our taxpayers or concern for American interests, national security, or our values. Right? How did we get to a place that institutional leaders in higher education do not care about the country?
It seems like they feel that they are evaluated. We're talking about university presidents and the highest level administrators based on how much money they raise, and that's it. And so whenever they see some sort of controversy, what have you, cancel culture area, they just want to tamp it down. It's not about enforcing principles. It's not that they themselves are radical Islamists or social justice warriors or pick your illiberal ideology. It's that they are spineless cowards who are careerist bureaucrats climbing that greasy pole by bringing in more money and trying to satisfy alumni by having nice nostalgic experiences. And the trustees are not doing their job in checking and evaluating what these university grandees are doing, because most trustees, whatever political allegiance they might have, are there because they like the prestige of being there, they want the good football and basketball tickets, and they like the nostalgia of coming back to their alma mater. And there's some, I should disclose, Ron DeSantis appointed me to the board of a public university, Florida Poly in Florida. But there's too few governors that are using that appointment power to appoint trustees that will really put the feet of these university leaders to the fire.
And in addition to raising money, the other thing they're evaluated on is what are your rankings on the U.S. News and World Report. And of course, the more grant money you get, the more prestigious the research university is. So if the grant money's coming from Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, it really doesn't matter, because that's going to help the prestige of our institution.
Well, in the most cynical argument, university administrators can point to the fact that all international students are paying full tuition, and that in some way of justifying this, that having more and more students whose parents are wealthy enough to cover that kind of tuition allows them to spend more on financial aid.
Right.
So if you really want to be cynical, that's another argument there for sure.
So the more foreign students who pay full freight, the more money you have to buy the top ACT, SAT students,
Right.
which is one of the things that moves you up the rankings.
Yes.
And my home community is home to one of these large Ivy League universities, and I can tell you that in that community, it is not fashionable to be patriotic. It is not fashionable to fly the flag. Certainly, you're not going to be wearing an American flag, pin. And things have only gotten more extreme over the past decade.
Yeah, globalism is a threat to Americanism, because people see themselves not as citizens of the United States and beneficiaries of the liberties and prosperities that we enjoy here, but members of the global community, and America's just another country, just like any other country. And you're right, patriotism is disparaged.
Yeah, and I suppose part of, but before we had DEI, we had Centers for Multicultural Studies, right? And they were designed to make the campus more welcoming for foreign students, right? So I think that that they're the institutes or the centers from which the DEI monstrosity grows. So it sort of seems like this effort to ensure that foreign money keeps flowing and that foreign students are comfortable has had the effect of creating incentives to undermine U.S. universities as like repositories of our civilizational inheritance and of American democracy, American values.
Yeah.
I think we saw these trends in Britain decades ago, the dynamic where foreign students would get in, pay full freight, and that's why it was so attractive. I have my master's degree from the London School of Economics. Maybe I benefited from looser admission standards when I got in there, because I wasn't on some of the support that my British colleagues had. I got scholarships from elsewhere. And you've seen the infiltration of British universities and the subversion of these values much earlier than you do with the Americans. So we're catching up in this unfortunate dynamic.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, before we jump to policy solutions that have been proposed, right? We've brought up boards of regents, we've brought up individual donors. What can institutional leaders do? What can donors do to try to correct course? I mean, American donors, donors who share the values of the institution. What can they do to course correct?
Well, this is where a lot of my work is based, and we've just put out a top 10 tips for donors to higher education. I mean, the first thing is do not make unrestricted gifts. Do not make endowment gifts. Don't just take the gift agreement that you get from the development folks at the university. Be much more strategic than you've been. Yes, I know that alums are always going to have a soft spot for the schools they attended, where they were in a fraternity, where they played football, where they met their spouse. But the reality is, don't assume that your alma mater is the best place to start making this change. Look at other institutions, ones whose values actually reflect your own more.
Or be more targeted even at your alma mater. If you're in a fraternity on the football team, donate to the fraternity and the football team. Or, centers that are doing good work. Robbie George's Madison program at Princeton. Donate there rather than to the unrestricted funds.
It could be a boom year for athletics.
Yeah, if you want to increase diversity, earmark scholarship for low-income students, But it's scholarships for low-income students, not for a huge DEI bureaucracy.
And think about rural kids more.
Yeah.
I mean, I really feel like that is the population in this country that's been left out a lot of higher education because the focus has been on, kids coming from the cities and low income there. But in a state like New York, there's a huge rural area in that state. And I think a lot of those children grow up believing that they could not possibly go to Columbia or NYU or Cornell. But they could, because all those foreign students will cover their financial aid. I mean, I'm afraid that I'm become too cynical.
Yeah.
Well, what about university boards, right? Before we get into the policy solution, how could a university board force the administration to take a hard look at foreign gifts and what's being funded?
Yeah, they have to ask the hard questions. How big is our DEI staff and how much money do we spend on salaries and operations for this huge bureaucracy? I saw some figures from the University of Michigan that were just mind-blowing.
More than 30 million annually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
230 full-time staff, double that if you count part-time that are doing so. Imagine the scholarships to underprivileged kids of all races that can come from that.
Yeah, I mean, that would make a real difference. Mitch Daniels was president of Purdue University. It's a science and engineering school, and he wanted to increase minority enrollment. But he found that kids from rural parts of Indiana who are minorities, primarily African American, just didn't have the math and science background. So to remedy the situation, he started public charter schools in the inner cities of Indiana. And he told me what I discovered was high school is too late. You have to start in middle school. So they started public charter schools in the inner cities of Indiana just so they could get kids who are qualified. The point is, they have the ability, but the schools are very, very weak. As a state superintendent of education and then as deputy superintendent, I've been in over 300 schools in 26 states across America. And I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we have some wonderful schools that'll make you cry because they're so good, and parents cry when talking about the schools. And I've seen some that are so bad that'll make you cry, and everything in between. But in general, you're right, Joanne. The worst schools are in the rural areas because it's hard to attract qualified teachers to some place where it's a 40-minute drive to the nearest fast food restaurant.
Yeah.
Well, with both trustees and donors, we've noticed in the last number of months that there are billionaires coming out of the woodwork. Bill Ackman, Mark Rowan at Penn, who all of a sudden the scales are falling from their eyes about what's going on at their alma maters, and they're taking public stands. But you don't have to be a billionaire. Universities notice groups of alumni. They notice participation rates in donations per year. Even if you're a $25 donor, if you and 10 others all of a sudden in your community aren't donating anymore, that's going to get noticed. They're very specific in how they understand this stuff. So there's room for that. All external shocks are important because they're not talking about internal reform or making the right arguments to the officials. You got to get trustees that care about kicking the tires and putting in the work of actually studying the books, not just having these glorified reunion weekends.
Yeah, I would just add that alumni participation rates are really important because they factor into rankings, right? So if we look at a university as prestige and wealth obsessed, if you can push down that prestige a little bit, they're going to react to whatever levers you're pulling.
Yeah.
I want to actually go back to something General Zais was saying about the STEM preparation, because it's actually tied to this issue in a counterintuitive way. One of the things universities say is we need all of these foreign students because American students aren't good enough in math and physics to actually play valuable roles in our labs, right? And so we know that's going to be the university pushback if we ever truly get serious about this. And so I think you're exactly right. Universities should start fixing this problem for themselves by using their intellectual talent to start building some of these pipeline programs and getting out there into the schools to improve math and science education.
And another school that's done that in addition to Purdue is Arizona State University. Again, running their own public charter schools, starting in elementary school that are feeders into Arizona State for that express purpose. So yeah, you can have quality schools, and being a rural school or an urban school does not condemn you to second-rate status. The highest performing public school district in the state of New York is not in affluent Albany or the affluent suburb of Westchester County. It's in Harlem, and it's the Success Academy Public Charter School District. And so low-income kids can learn given the right environment and highly effective teachers, which they too often do not encounter in their traditional public schools.
It's also not the case that the foreign students coming in are necessarily the best prepared. I think you mentioned this already. A lot of places, they're kind of flooded because they pay full tuition, but they're not necessarily the very best students. And so it's not even if that's the problem, this is not the solution for it.
Yeah, and to bring it back to your board leadership point, there's no reason why governing boards can't say, why aren't we doing something to improve teacher training? Why aren't we building that capacity? We want to become known for this instead of our $30 million DEI program.
Yeah.
But I'd say one of the questions donors should be asking is how board members are nominated, because
Very good.
alumni have lost almost all of their ability to nominate directly members of the boards of trustees of major institutions. And in a blue state, for example, so let's take New York, because one university, and I'll go say it, Cornell is a land-grant university, quite a chunk of those trustees are coming from the governor's office, the assembly, and the state senate. But the alumni can no longer directly nominate someone to be eligible to run as a Board of Trustee member. And I think that has changed quite a bit across the Ivies in particular. So that question of where are the trustees coming from, where are the nominees coming from, is a really important one. Otherwise, you've just got these self-perpetuating boards that maybe are too easy on the administration of that campus.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we know that there are governors who are taking this seriously in Florida and Virginia. Do you see any examples in the private world of alumni pressure and donor pressure really starting to affect university governance? Or maybe we have to come back to the question in about a year.
Your answer. No, we don't see it.
I did want to say something, though. I just saw the case study on giving to colleges and universities, fiscal 23, and it was down $2 billion from fiscal 22.
Wow.
And that fiscal year ends at June 30th, so it doesn't even include what might be happening after October 7th. So I think that this next round of fundraising is going to be a very, very interesting one. The other thing that report showed was that the drop-off is among individuals. Corporations are giving more. Foundations are pretty much staying even. They are seeing a huge rise in gifts from donor advised funds, which probably are individuals. But it will be interesting to look at this next fiscal year, because any donor revolt that's happening is happening now.
Related to that, Joanne, is the poll results that show that Americans have less and less confidence in institutions of higher education. And the percentage of high school graduates who are going on to higher education is falling. A four-year college degree no longer carries the cachet that it carried 40 years ago. It's no longer a ticket to the middle class that it once was. The president of the local technical college in South Carolina where I live, with upwards of 10,000 students, told me that 25% of his student body had a 4-year college degree. What they didn't have were any marketable skills. So they were coming back to the technical college to be certified as a registered nurse, as an automotive mechanic, to getting a certification in welding or mechatronics and high-tech manufacturing. I met with the president of Boeing, South Carolina, where they're manufacturing the Dreamliner. And he told me, Mick, I can get all the electrical, mechanical, and aeronautical engineers that I need from Clemson University and Georgia Tech. What I have a real hard time finding are people with the skills to build my airplanes. And those skills do not require a 4-year degree, and they are very high paying.
Yeah, so I think it's the lack of return on investment that's pushing confidence down, but also the things we've been talking about, right? Everybody sees now that universities are they're not a thriving marketplace of ideas where you can explore dangerous ideas that maybe you hadn't come across before. And they see the anti-Semitism problem, right? And they also see the racialized campus, and that leads to anxiety about sending your kids there.
Well, anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine. It's always the leading indicator of other things that are wrong with the culture, with whatever the institution is, and we've seen that there's just a moral corruption and a betrayal of the basic values on which Western universities were founded.
And an ignorance of history.
Yes.
You know, the Jews were in the Middle East long before the Arabs were, but the Jews are accused. Or Israelis are accused of being colonialists. Wait a minute.
Well, and that ignorance is one of the reasons why when you send a young person off to one of these highly ideological schools, they're so susceptible to that indoctrination, right? Because they can't push back.
It's bizarre that the great centers of anti-Semitism in America are its institutions, especially the elite institutions of higher education, where supposedly the most progressive, educated people reside. It's just bizarre.
Is it bizarre though? or you know, I'll throw out an idea. Is it the case that the DEI ideology primes people to see the world?
Well, that's clearly true. But you know, not knowing anything about developments in the last 20 years, just you know, it's just not the place that you would think in a developed country would be the font of irrational bigotry.
Yeah, no, but I think those two things come together, right? The tremendous growth in DEI primes people to make identity-based judgments, and then at these elite universities that are taking millions of dollars from the Gulf states, they have a department that's dedicated to demonizing Israel.
Right.
You put those things together, and it isn't all that surprising why we have the problems we have today.
I'd like to end this part of the conversation on a little hopeful note, though, and I can tell you that the donors that we are speaking with at Philanthropy Roundtable are very interested in alternatives to four-year college. So it can be, I mean, many interested in better K-12 training, but also then trade schools, community colleges, and I think we're going to see there may continue to be a significant shift in post-secondary education. If a lot of that money drains from the four-year colleges and goes, we will be in a different place economically as a nation too. Because you're right, students are no longer believing that there's any kind of income bump from just a four-year degree.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we move to a solution that's on the table, right? So Representative Michelle Steele's DETERRENT Act was introduced in December. It would lower the foreign gift disclosure threshold to $50,000 and require universities to disclose the purpose of the gift. Right? So you'd have to tell the department what it's for, in addition to how much it was and who it came from. And it would prohibit partnerships with countries of concern. So there are 4 countries named. That would be North Korea, China, Iran, and Russia. But the department, working with state and defense, could designate other countries. And then it would also require disclosure of any foreign gifts to staff and faculty at research institutions. So what do you think about the DETERRENT Act? Maybe we'll start with you, General. You've been a university president. Would this change university behavior?
Well, they won't change behavior until they see somebody suffer consequences for failure to comply with the law. We have a law in place right now, and they basically, our universities are thumbing their nose at the law, and the U.S. Department of Education is complicit in this. So under the current regime, or the current law, The only thing the Department of Education can do is refer the most egregious offenders to the Department of Justice for some kind of prosecution and fine. But even in the previous administration, the Department of Justice was uninterested in follow-up. We would refer cases to them, and they said, we got bigger problems than charitable giving to colleges and universities. So the proof will be in the pudding. If there are prosecutions and fines, it will change behavior. If they're not, behavior won't change. Now, there's certain things that can be done. You know, we can't eliminate the study of Arabic in our schools. You know, it's important.
We shouldn't. It's
Yeah,
foreign
we
language.
should. It's a foreign language. One of the reasons we embraced the Chinese in our schools was because they provided free Mandarin instructors. They're free. They're paid for by the Chinese Communist Party. During the previous administration, to get the communists out of the classroom, we worked to develop a memorandum of agreement with the Taiwanese government for faculty exchanges and foreign language instructors, because it's not a part of the world that we can write off. But we ought to have capitalists and people from a democratic country that appreciate democratic values of the American people in our classrooms, rather than the people from a totalitarian state trying to indoctrinate our students subtly, but it takes place.
So any other thoughts on the DETERRENT Act? I mean, enforcement's got to be a priority. We need to refocus our programs on language.
I like the response, the statement by the National Association of Scholars, which generally does good work, and they kind of looked at it line by line, very lawyerly analysis, I should say, which I appreciate, and that some of the language I think could be sharpened to, for example, allow Americans living abroad to donate to be counted as American donors, whereas foreigners donating from America should be counted as foreign, not American, things like that, as well as the definition of what a foreign agent is. But generally, I think it's the right approach. The devil is in the details, and the devil's in how it's enforced, as the general said. So you can have all the pretty laws on the books. We already have good laws that aren't being enforced. So I think, you know, enforcing our existing laws is just as important, or even more so perhaps, than adding this new one, which is generally good.
So the roundtable does have some concerns about the bill as it's written right now, and I want to say first up front, it is not that we are favoring these countries that are trying to do ill to our country, but we have had a very firm position to protect donor privacy and philanthropy. Because we don't want those donors to be harassed or, you know, taken off the path they really want to follow. And that position was basically agreed to by the Supreme Court in the Bonta decision. And the part of NAS, I did read that whole thing, and thank you, Ilya, for mentioning that, is that idea of having a public searchable database of foreign donors. And a couple of things about that I think we have concerns with. One is there's got to be a clear distinction between donations that are coming from foreign governments and foreign political parties and simply foreign individuals. And the bill doesn't really clarify that in any way yet. And we're concerned about having this database because we know that donors here, domestic donors, are already giving anonymously to avoid some of those problems. And the other issue, finally, is that the issue isn't really who the donor is, it's what the grant is for and what kind of limitations that's putting on the kind of academic freedom of a university, or what kind of payback is going to a foreign country because of that grant. I think that if people saw a database that actually talked about the purpose of the grants, everyone's hair would be on fire. But the donors alone won't give you that information, and I'm afraid that a lot of really innocent foreign donors are going to get caught up in, you know, something that could get very ugly.
One of the things that institutions have done in the past, and there's a provision in the new legislation that basically repeats provisions in the old legislation that says you can't launder the money. In other words, if the Saudi government gives money to a Saudi foundation, that gives it to an American foundation, that then gives it to the Foundation for Georgetown University, that still should be counted as a foreign gift, even if it most directly came from an American foundation. But that's the way that money's being washed or laundered to hide its source. And that's going to be very hard to enforce, but we need to continue to enforce that aspect of the statute as well.
So it sounds like enforcement has to be a real priority of the next administration. I'm getting back to something you said, Joanne. It kind of sounds like, and this seems reasonable to me, the purpose of the gift should determine the level of scrutiny, right? Does that sort of seem like a principle that we might?
Probably the amount of the gift as well.
Fair point. Yeah. One of the remarkable things to me doing some research, I went back. I've been reading the New York Times from the 1980s, and this was a hot button concern in the 1980s. Right, in the pages of the New York Times, all this money going to elite universities to build these new programs.
Yeah, the proximate example in 1986, there was a lot of Arab money that was coming in to fund the building of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University, and it was right next door to Congress, and that's why they got interested in 1986 to pass the original legislation.
Yeah, well, we're doing our best to raise the level of concern today. Well, we have some audience questions, so why don't we shift gears a little bit? We have a timely one from Lawrence. He asks, is there any comparison between the deleterious effects of the Confucius Institutes and TikTok hysteria?
And
right?
what?
And TikTok hysteria, right? So, I mean, these are two ways that the CCP is trying to change our culture, trying to change our perception of China. Any thoughts on TikTok and the relationship to?
Well, I have thoughts on TikTok and the Gallagher bill that's trying to force divestiture of it and looks likely to pass the House overwhelmingly. I'm generally supportive of that approach because it focuses on divestiture, not on the actual speech. But as you said, that at a high level, the connection is that the Chinese are engaged in information warfare to both try to steal information, spy, intellectual property and so forth, while at the same time sowing chaos in our culture and in our politics.
And to normalize perceptions of despotic governments. Like the message is, oh yes, we have a different system in America, but it works for us, and the Chinese people love it, and one size doesn't fit all, and democracy is a way of running your country. I mean, that's the soft propaganda that causes our students to believe that nonsense and then run amok and do stupid things like embrace regimes, like, in countries where women are chattel or property and women's rights don't exist, how can you be a woman, be a vocal advocate for Arab culture? I mean, it's crazy. Or gay culture, where they throw you off a tall building, but you're a vocal advocate for Arab culture? Come on.
I mean, we're focusing very much on higher education, but I mentioned earlier when we were talking among ourselves, I think the cultural indoctrination is so much more insidious because it comes in a form of entertainment. And people accept it, and because it's entertainment, they're not analyzing it the way they might analyze something like a Confucius Institute.
Yeah, to me, it shows that we've lost confidence in ourselves and our civilization, that we're turning over how we educate young people
Absolutely.
to influencers in a different country. Right? It's an astonishing thing.
Yeah. I read an interesting quote today that much of social media is antisocial, and too much use of the smartphone makes you stupid.
That seems fair. So Donna asks, are you optimistic that the Congressional Committee, House Ed and Workforce, led by Congresswoman Fox, will uncover what's actually going on at UPenn? And so I'll broaden that a little bit and just ask, are these hearings, do we think that these hearings, and we know that there are a couple coming up, are they going to continue to really shed light on the problems in higher ed?
Well, the one with the 3 university presidents in December obviously changed the whole conversation and elevated the rot in American higher ed into the national discourse. I testified before that committee about a year ago. It was March of last year, about the possibility of attaching free speech-related strings on federal funding, because there's already obviously tons of strings that range from anti-discrimination principles to accounting standards and what have you, so you can enforce other things that way. But I think Chairwoman Foxx has been shrewd in how she's used the hearings to illuminate problems in addition to proposed bills.
And I think we've got the anti-Semitism hearings coming up now. I mean, Harvard is already in trouble because they didn't submit the information that Chairman Foxx asked for. So I think this is going to be an ongoing headline for quite a while. And if it wakes up more Americans, that's great. I do worry that lowering the threshold to 50,000 might end up being such a burden that a lot goes, unnoticed. But I don't think it was unreasonable to do that. I just realize now that there's just going to be another windfall of gifts that you're going to be looking at.
Yeah. And another view on that, though, is that these research universities maintain really good databases on their donors. They maintain good databases on their contracts. They maintain really good databases on grants. And they have to report this information to the IRS anyway, and they have annual audits from external audit agencies. So the notion that reporting requirements are too onerous is really not correct. You already got the data. You just have to input it to the Department of Education's portal.
Yeah, and we know that universities employ armies of administrators as it is. I mean, some universities are up to an administrator per student, per FTE student, so maybe this retasks a person or two for a couple minutes or a couple months of the year. We have a big picture question from Maryland, and that is the openness of American society and our universities are a great strength, but they also create these vulnerabilities. How do we close the campus to malicious foreign influence without hurting ourselves and without hurting the research or learning liberal arts enterprise?
Well, I think we've been talking about that, and that's what the Disclose Act is trying to get at, the Deterrent Act, sorry. But the thing is, you can't close Pandora's box in the sense of information flows, and we were talking about that with TikTok, but students get lots of information from everywhere. It's not just, you fix the professorial hiring or funding or whatever, well, that's great, but they still live in a broader culture where we have these issues, not all of which require or even can be fixed with whether federal or state legislative action.
And I think that the answer is more viewpoint diversity on those campuses, more open debates, more open discussion of different ideas. I know early in the response to October 7th, there was one group of faculty members at a university that came together. They certainly were pro-Israel, but their comment was, we haven't done enough. We failed. We haven't had those open forums on issues like this, and the students are hearing very one-sided arguments because the university isn't open enough. And the viewpoint diversity on the academic side is probably my primary issue, because I've watched specific departments that taught me. And I look at who's teaching in that department now, and I read their resumes and what their topics are, and it's painful. It's painful for me to see multiple American historians creating victim-oppressor analogs for the United States, analogies, I should say, for the United States. It's just, I've come from a family of immigrants. It's not, we didn't have wealth, but boy, there was nothing about our household that was not patriotic. And I think it's so fascinating to me now that you have to worry if you're going to fly the American flag. It's just, and we're just seeing that, and that whole concept transferred to campuses without anybody stopping it.
Deans and presidents are very good at instilling whatever values or cultures they want, whether it be public service, entrepreneurship, social justice, or anything else. And so they can use their memos, their programs, their modeling of events, to orientations, very important, to show what it is to be part of the higher education community, what it is to mature into a productive member of society. And so, a lot of this is not that you just throw up your hands and say, the kids these days, it's a failure of leadership and a failure of recognition that letting these values go by the the wayside does real harm.
Yeah, I think a lot of presidents are reluctant to weigh in. Generally, faculty are hired by the other faculty within their department.
That's right.
And in many, many instances, one's commitment to DEI is just as heavily weighted as your research and publications. And that's how we get people who are heading institutions with really second-rate scholarship, like the recently resigned president of Harvard. I mean, nobody would say she was a first-rate scholar, but she had other factors that eventuated with her being the president of Harvard University. But it wasn't based on the quality of her scholarship or publications. And that's going on across
Even quite
America.
apart from plagiarism concerns.
Even apart from plagiarism concerns. And that's going on in academic departments and universities across America and contributes to the lack of faculty viewpoint diversity.
The gold standard has emerged of faculty governance, of university governance, which is the University of Chicago trifecta, as it's called sometimes. The free speech principles are perhaps the most famous, but there's also the Shill's report on viewpoint neutrality and faculty hiring, and the Calvin report on institutional neutrality, so you're not forced to make a statement on every little political development in the world. You know, if schools truly adopted those and enforced just those three things, I think that would go a long way.
Yeah, the existence of free speech zones on campus, or the notion that one needs to provide a safe space for students where they won't hear ideas that offend them, contributes to this lack of diversity of viewpoint that's so pervasive.
And a lack of critical thinking skills.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
Former University of Chicago President Hannah Holborn Gray used to say that the purpose of education is to make you feel uncomfortable. That's a sense of growth, that you're actually encountering new ideas and grappling with them and evaluating them.
Yeah.
I mean, you asked me about donors before, and this is one thing I would say is for donors, find the courageous men and women on those campuses and back them. Even if it makes you unpopular as a trustee or as a football patron or whatever peer group you associate with in that university, do it because they're there. I mean, I know they're there. I've spoken with them. They really want to deal with these issues. They want to bring students to a point where they're comfortable with discomfort. They want more open debates on their campus. They're terrified now about what kinds of crowds are going to show up and, speakers being blocked from speaking. But they know that that's what they need to do, and they could use to have people say to them, "You're on the right path. We're going to support you, not just financially, but we're going to speak about it too, because we are donors to this institution, and we will be listened to."
And related to what you said, Ilya, academic leaders have to have the spine to discipline students who break the rules of the institution, or even state or federal law. In general, they don't.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up on solutions, leadership, and those three cardinal commitments that the University of Chicago has pioneered. But I want to thank the panel. I think this has been a great discussion. So thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Ilya. Thank you, Mick. And thank you to Manhattan Institute and to AFPI for organizing this.